Other places in Chile, they're ripping up vines. And then, for instance, in Greece, I remember seeing in Crete, just vines that had just died with heat. Yeah, this is just very striking.
In this ClimateGenn episode, I'm speaking with journalist and author Andy Neather about his new book, Rooted in Change: The Stories Behind Sustainable Wine, co-authored with Master of Wine Jane Masters. The authors set out to document the challenges facing all aspects of wine production, from the vineyard to the glass. For a few notes on wine, it makes up an estimated 0.3% of agriculture globally, and yet despite this tiny proportion, it is a beverage that humans have been making for thousands of years, serving sometimes with food or as a ceremonial drink, or in times more extreme as a source of calories for French soldiers in the First World War trenches. Today, vineyards around the world, from France to Australia or Chile to China, are at risk from worsening impacts of climate change. And in that sense, this 0.3% of agriculture is as vulnerable as much as the other 99.7% of agriculture that underpins our global food supply. As Professor Paul Behrens said in the previous episode, 30 to 40% of inflation on food in the UK today is due to climate change. A decade ago in Champagne, a wine producer told me harvest dates shifted forward in the late 1980s due to warming. Polar researchers I'd interviewed earlier noted Arctic sea ice decline accelerated in the same decade. Both independent observations that confirm the same reality, that our world is heating up. This new book, Rooted in Change, gives us a glimpse of the global response of the wine industry to save itself while acting responsibly as stewards of both land and the atmosphere. In the next episode, I'm speaking with fashion designer turned Extinction Rebellion co-founder Claire Farrell. I caught up with Claire in Helsinki last week, where she had just interviewed eminent climate scientist Dr. James Hansen as part of the Atlas 25 conference. Members can listen to the interview with Claire on YouTube and Patreon. I will also be speaking with Nick Aldridge about the national emergency briefing he has organised to be in Westminster in the UK, with over 100 MPs and others attending on November the 27th. Many more interviews are on the way. Thank you for listening. Please do continue to comment, share, and if you can, become a member to support the podcast. Thank you. Andy, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me about your book, Rooted in Change, which is a deep dive into the sustainability in the wine industry. Can you sketch out your climate sustainability perspective before you embarked on this book project?
Sure. I would say that I would classify myself as a committed environmentalist for probably 25 years now. I mean, what really convinced me of the importance of environment, particularly climate change, was working at Friends of the Earth. I worked at Friends of the Earth for 2-3 years, back end of the 90s. It was right around the time of the Kyoto summit, and I went from being a broadly sympathetic, left of centre person to really the environment being at the centre of my politics and sort of, what my priorities were. And then while I was at the Evening Standard, I was the comment editor and chief leader writer. I also, fairly quickly after arriving there in '04, I picked up the wine critic job just because there wasn't one at the time. And I was a knowledgeable amateur, and I lobbied the editor, and she gave in the end, basically. And while I was at the Standard, I did various environmental writing. I did an environmental column for a while, and then I led a couple of major campaigns that we had, one on cycling provision and one on air quality. And then after the Standard, I was at Transport for London for nearly about 9 years. Latterly, I was leading on strategic comms on air quality and environment, on sustainability. So, I mean, I've got a fairly long record on that. While I was at TfL, I started blogging about wine to keep my wine writing going. And then I sort of bailed out of the day job last November. Fortuitously, around the time I was trying to get out, I met Hermione Ireland, who is the MD of Académie du Vin Library. It it was at a party for the start of Greek Wine Month last May of last year, and she said, "Oh, I'm looking for a journalist to write me a book about wine and climate change." And I said, "That's me," because I had been thinking about writing exactly such a book. And I hadn't actually written up a proposal, but I'd started thinking through how I would structure it and how I'd research it. And then Hermione separately, a few weeks later, ran into Jane Masters, MW, and none of us knew each other. And Jane said, "Oh, I've started writing a book on sustainability, but I had to shelve it because she'd taken a day job as a buyer at Majestic." And anyway, Hermione put us together. We got on well. We had a discussion about how we'd do it. And then I conducted a pretty heavy edit of what Jane had written up to that point. She'd written bits of various chapters. We talked about structure and research. I bailed out of my day job in November. And from that point, I was working on it full time. And yeah, so it's been a remarkably quick turnaround for a whole book. I mean, we probably had about half a book's worth of material that Jane had done before, and which I then sort of cut back and sort of radically restructured. But still, we only submitted the manuscript at the start of June. So, I mean, Académie du Vin Library have turned the whole thing around very quickly as well. But the real field research was in January to April of this year, and I was traveling in California, Italy. I was at the Paris Wine Fair, Portugal, South Africa, Chile, Argentina, and Greece. And I mean, I couldn't get to the Antipodes; it just wasn't time. But so we had to be selective. I mean, and yeah, I mean, it's just incredibly interesting and inspiring seeing winemakers in all of these very different places, dealing with the same challenges, not just climate change, incidentally. I mean, all sorts of things like, for instance, dwindling rural labor forces is an issue in particularly, I mean, Greece, Portugal, Chile, across the board.
I want to talk about social sustainability in a moment, but
So,
the stories is important. You've got the science side of it,
yeah,
and then there is with this kind of going on the road, and there's a lot of travel writing in a way.
yeah.
When you sort of put all this together, can you give us a glimpse of some of the issues that you were getting up close with that we might not sort of typically think about
Well,
in wine?
I think it's a combination of. I mean, on the one hand, there were a bunch of things which I knew about intellectually, of course, like climate change, where I still think seeing it on the ground and people telling you what's happening on the ground is very striking. I mean, I remember, for instance, in Chile, I mean, Chile arguably has got the biggest problem of any country because of climate change, because of rainfall just drying up dramatically over the last 20 years. Chile has had a mega drought, so-called, that lasted about a decade, which officially has sort of ended, except it hasn't to the extent that they had a couple of wetter winters, but it hasn't, the average hasn't returned to what it was before. But I remember, for instance, at Ventisquero, at their main site, which they planted in 2001, when they planted it out, they were taking their water from 7 wells that they drilled. All but one of them has now dried up. And so they're pumping off an aquifer. And I mean, it will dry up.
Yeah.
Other places in Chile, they're ripping up vines. And then, for instance, in Greece, I remember seeing in Crete, yeah, just vines that had just died with heat. Yeah, this is just very striking. The most surprising things, I guess, that I saw were the things which are sort of completely outside my professional experience. And that was really more at the packaging and transport end of it. So, I mean, I should probably preface that by saying, for listeners who haven't read it yet, I mean, Jane and I were very keen that we should follow the journey of wine from grape to glass in terms of its environmental impact, in particular its carbon footprint, but not just that. And that means that you really have to look at packaging and distribution because, I mean, while most wine writers are primarily interested, obviously, in the wine, how it's made and where it's from, around 40% of the carbon footprint of a bottle of wine is just the glass bottle. And then you can add a load more, up to about 20% more for distribution and so on. And I wanted to see those processes and understand them. So I went to bottle factories and I went to, bottling plants and a recycling plant, and also to Portugal to see the cork industry and the whole closures question. And no, I mean these sort of big, bottle factories, and I mean, are just gobsmacking the sort of size and complexity. And it's also to do with international supply chains. And one knows intellectually that the sort of products that we use are shipped across the world and so on. But it's so complicated. And there are so many considerations in terms of your ultimate goal of in reducing your carbon emissions, all the while trying to make a profit, obviously. You've got to have financially viable business. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what you're doing about sustainability. Those kind of things were the really different things I found out, I guess.
There's these sort of carbon issues that are sort of tied up with the whole packaging, and you touched on the social sustainability and the other side of it, which is sort of
Yeah,
cultural identity, which is woven into the production and the consuming. And in the book, you cited that there are sort of 3 million jobs in Europe tied to
yeah,
the wine industry,
yeah,
which is more than I would have thought, actually.
yeah.
But you also highlight the challenges in keeping the next generation interested. When you looked into this, what is your view of the next generation of wine? I mean, do you think it's a
Well,
resilient
Well,
industry?
I think it works both ways, both in terms of producers and consumers. So there is a definite issue in terms of producers, I think right across Europe, that the perception in the industry is that young people don't want to work the land, particularly in Greece. There's a real shortage of labor, and Greeks as a nation they're particularly sort of highly educated and go to university and so on. They don't want to work the land. But even, for instance, in Bordeaux, the Wine Society ran a very good seminar on social sustainability and labour issues earlier this year, and Alain Zichel, who is the president of the CIVB, the sort of the professional grouping in Bordeaux. I mean, he was saying there's an initiative in the area to, basically to get kids in secondary schools interested in wine careers. And you said you do an experiment in a school where you ask how many kids know somebody that works in the wine industry, and several hands will go up. How many of you are interested in going into the wine industry? None. So even in the sort of the most famous wine area in Europe, I suppose that's an issue. It's an issue for instance, in the Douro Valley in Portugal, where traditionally, obviously, they supplied grapes for the port houses, but increasingly for still wine as well. The average age of I was talking to Symingtons, and they were saying the average age of their growers, their growers tend to be quite small. They'll have like a hectare or two. And it's the kind of thing somebody might do while they have a day job. So they might have a day job in a hotel or something. But he said the average age of their growers is in their early 60s, and they are dying out, and they'll retire when it just becomes physically too much for them. And the younger generation are moving to the cities or to the coast. And again, it's, you vineyard work is hard. For instance, in that case, in the Douro, Symingtons have thought very carefully about essentially how you reshape a rural economy. I mean, wine tourism is a major part of it, and about how you create career paths for local people. I mean, you need skills like, for instance, languages, which traditionally those people wouldn't have spoken English because they didn't need to, obviously. You need people with the language skills, with the skills in hospitality management, but then you can create careers for people doing that. This is in its early phases. In terms of consumers, that's an area with wine where getting the next generation interested has had a lot more attention in the wine press. I mean, particularly over the last couple of years. There's generally a crisis in wine consumption. Consumption is falling sort of across the board in most countries, including England. And a major component of that is seen to be the apparent lack of interest of young people who would prefer other drinks or they drink less or whatever. I mean, there's been lots and lots written about this. My view personally is that it's probably more cyclical than structural. I think that the economic situation is a major issue. I think actually across the board, that's one of the main reasons people are spending less on wines because there's been quite steep inflation in wine as in other things. And, times are quite tight, but it's certainly an issue. And in terms of how we make wine accessible to people, especially young people, no, I mean that's a big topic of concern right now.
It's interesting as well how what you've been saying. You talked about the social side of it, and then you talk about the consuming side of it. Both of these connect to the economic sustainability, because if you've got no
Sure.
workers, you've got no wine, and if you've got no money, you've got no workers, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Um, and we also, on just touching on the economic side, we equate action with becoming sustainable and doing all the things around it as improving, ultimately also improving the quality of the wine as well as its sort of
Mm.
sustainable credentials. And
Mhm.
with that, we associate increased prices. Were there instances where you saw producers doing the right thing and making decisions that benefited sustainability, but also lowered costs?
Yeah, I think that there are, and it's important to emphasize this because there is a perception, I think generally in a lot of places that the things that you need to do to make yourself sustainable are expensive and will cost you money and will ultimately drive up your prices. I mean, first of all, chemicals, for instance, agrochemicals are not cheap. I mean, to think that there's this cheap, they're not. I've just written a piece about the use of herbicides in champagne, for instance, which is and it's really not necessary. So you've got champagne growers spending a load of money on glyphosate, which they really don't need to. I remember when I was in California, I talked to Hilary Graves, the vineyard manager of Booker, which is it's a sort of a boutique high-end winery. But she was saying, for them, for instance, they were doing drone drops of predator insects so that they drop lacewings from a drone. It would take one guy with a drone a couple of hours to do the whole vineyard like this. It's cheaper than using chemicals. And there's various places where you can do that. Take, for instance, renewable energy. So, I mean, if you're making capital investments, like, for instance, putting in solar panels, for instance, buying electric tractors, I mean, yes, that's an investment. I wouldn't suggest that farmers do it immediately. Obviously, you're going to wait until you need to replace your current kit. But when you make those choices, there will be a payback. In renewable energy, for instance, I mean, especially in Europe, where energy prices have spiked since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what some producers I've talked to who put in renewable power, they've found that their payback time has fallen quite steeply. I mean, it's fallen from like say 6, 7 years to 3 years. Really not that much. In various places, most obviously South Africa, there's also it's part of your sort of resilience as a business because I mean the electric network is the grid is so unreliable. You're essentially insulating yourself from that. I mean, Tony Malinowski, the chief winemaker at Raffini in Sussex, was saying to me just recently, we'd like that freedom. And they do actually generate all of their power by solar, but they want more capacity so they can plug in electric tractors in the evenings to charge up and things. He said, we want that freedom because we've seen over the past few years, prices fluctuating wildly, all based on things we can't control. So you have more control if you build that resilience into your business. So,
Okay.
those kind of investments are not cheap, but I don't think there's a straight translation of sustainability is expensive. It's not always, and it's more complicated than that.
A lot of these issues, there's a lot of depth in every single aspect of what you've just mentioned. Were you able through this to see a sort of order or sort of a workable future out of all of this? Or did you end up with it thinking, oh my God, this is all chaos?
I think that just to be clear, the challenges of climate change in particular are enormous. And most of the really important decisions are beyond the scope of the wine industry. And I mean the industry and not even a particular vineyard. Of course, you need the sort of international level agreements, the COP and so on. And of course, things like Trump's stance, it's very damaging and it's worrying. Um, but at the same time, I mean, you have to try and change things on your patch. And in the wine industry, I mean, there's one of the inspiring things was traveling the world and seeing people doing all these impressive things that were genuinely changing the way that they made wine. They're not the majority yet. So take, for instance, organic agriculture. The highest proportion in the world is Austria, which they've hit 25% now. It's getting on for that in France now. I mean, which is impressive compared to what it was, say, 20 years ago. As a journalist, like I want to say, well, what about the other 75%? And there's a long way to go on that. You could choose similar examples wherever. There is a long way to go. I think it can be done though.
You do see a bit of order then. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a market, and
So
there is obviously chaos in markets, and they're dynamic. They're shifting the whole time. And the backdrop of all this, in terms of markets, which I mean we talk about in the book, is this fall in wine consumption, which has caused major anxiety in the industry. I mean, particularly in North America, but elsewhere too. And this, the key issue about financial sustainability, particularly producers in South Africa said this to me. It's like, I guess because they feel, they're sort of financially quite often less secure than major European regions, and they said no, without a business, there's no jobs and there's no sustainability. So I mean, you have to be financially sustainable as almost your starting point. It's difficult. And in a situation in that kind of market, people are less keen to spend money on, investing in sustainability. So I mean, it's difficult.
you talked about, young people. Part of
Yeah,
this story that you're telling here is a values-based story. Do you think that this
absolutely.
form of storytelling, that there is a bit of a responsibility to try and match the values of the broader
I think I think
generation?
absolutely there is, and all of the polling, I should say, I mean, all of the polling full stop with consumers shows that they want to buy more sustainable products. You could be a bit cynical about that and say, well, it doesn't necessarily translate to their buying choices. I mean, it does for some of them, but certainly amongst young people, yes. I mean, that they are, all of the science and polling are that environmental justice, social justice is a bigger deal for them. And, that is going to feed through gradually over time in terms of, the kinds of companies that succeed and the sort of stories that, I'm thinking even at the level of sort of retailers, the sort of stories that you're able to tell in terms of your wine's provenance. I think that's going to matter more and more as those market preferences shift over time. It's a gradual process. So I think there's actually strong incentives for wine sellers to start to move in that direction now. And also, obviously at the level of wine production as well. It gives you a story to tell.
In the book, at the end of chapters, you have these sort of bullet points and key points, which
Yes.
they are sort of practical and they inspire a little bit of action. As you come away from doing the book, you write your Substack, you write other articles and so on. Is this sort of what we've been talking about, infusing your own work?
Oh, absolutely. It's certainly sustainability. I mean, as I've said, I've long been an environmentalist and particularly interested in things like organic agriculture. But no, I mean, it's become a much more central part of my wine writing. Absolutely. And it's, as I said, you have to do what you can on your patch in terms of action on climate change and on sustainability. My patch is that I'm a journalist, and it's so yes, that's what I write about, and hoping that that makes people more aware of the issues. I mean, like all journalism, in a way, it's not actually changing anything directly. It's not like I'm making a decision to source a lighter weight bottle or to stop using a particular pesticide or whatever, but it's getting the word out and getting people interested in those issues.
Yeah, and it helps us articulate these issues, which I think is also really important. But yeah,
Mm,
thank you very much. It's been great to speak to you, and it is a really book for our times, I think. So that's great.
thank you. My pleasure.
If you are concerned about the future, then why not travel with me through every COP conference from COP21 in Paris to COP28 in Dubai by ordering my book COP Out: How Governments Have Failed the People on Climate. In COP Out you'll gain insights into what is actually going on in these supposed world-saving conferences and how we have ended up in this dire era of dangerous consequences. You can order COP Out via the link in the notes or on any online bookstore worldwide in paperback or audio version.